Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we ride the forgotten post roads of colonial America and muddy, lantern-lit paths where riders carried secrets, scandals, and stolen letters through a sleeping country most history books never bothered to map. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let your shoulders settle downward, just a little. Let the weight of the day begin to release, very slowly, the way light fades from a winter sky, not all at once, but by degrees. Tonight, we are going somewhere far away. Not in distance exactly, but in time. We are going back to a world that was quieter than this one. A world lit mostly by fire. A world where news traveled on horseback, and the sound of hooves on a dirt road was one of the most important sounds a person could hear. We are going to walk very slowly along the old post roads of colonial America. Roads that ran through pine forests and river crossings, through sleeping villages and muddy lowlands, through a continent that was still learning its own shape. There is no urgency here. No arrival time. We are simply riding, gently, through a lantern-lit world. Part 1: The Silence Before the Road. Before we speak of roads, we should speak of the silence that came before them. Imagine standing at the edge of a forest somewhere along what is now the northeastern coast of North America. The year is somewhere in the early 1600s. The trees around you are enormous, far larger than most trees that exist today in this part of the world, white pines so tall their crowns disappear into low cloud, oaks whose trunks would take 3 people with linked arms to encircle, hemlocks that have stood in that exact spot for 2 centuries before the first English ship arrived offshore. The forest is not silent, exactly. There is wind moving through the upper branches. There are birds, an astonishing number of birds by the standards of a later age, passenger pigeons in flocks so vast they darkened the sky for hours as they passed overhead, with thrushes and warblers and the slow hollow drumming of woodpeckers somewhere deeper among the trees. There is the sound of water, always, in this landscape, streams running cold and clear over rounded stones, the distant rush of a river somewhere beyond the ridgeline. But there are no roads. Not in the way we would understand them. There are paths. Many paths, actually. More than the early European settlers often realized when they arrived and looked at the forest and called it wilderness, which was their word for empty, though it was not empty at all. The indigenous peoples of the northeastern woodlands, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, the Wampanoag, the Pequot, the Massachusetts, and dozens of other nations had been moving through this landscape for thousands of years. And in that movement, they had created something remarkable. A network of trails, worn into the earth by uncountable footsteps, that connected village to village, hunting ground to fishing ground, ceremonial site to trading center. These trails were not random. They followed the logic of the land with extraordinary precision. They ran along ridgelines where the walking was easy and dry. They found the shallowest fords across rivers, the gentlest grades through hills, the passages through wetlands that would otherwise swallow a traveler. They connected the inland to the coast, the north to the south, the mountains to the tidal rivers. Some of these trails were very old indeed. Certain routes through the Appalachian foothills may have been in continuous use for 8 or 10,000 years, worn first by the animals that moved along them, bison, elk, deer following the same ancient paths season after season, and then by the human beings who followed the animals, and then by the human nations who came to know the land so intimately that their trails became, in effect, a kind of knowledge encoded in the earth itself. When European settlers began to move inland from their coastal footholds in the early decades of the 17th century, they did not build new roads from nothing. They could not have. The forest was too dense, the terrain too complex, the distances too vast for a newcomer to navigate from scratch. Instead, they followed the trails that already existed. They widened them, or tried to. They marked them with blazes cut into tree bark. They built crude bridges over streams that had always been forded on foot. The first roads of colonial America were, in almost every case, indigenous trails with new names. The Connecticut Path, one of the earliest overland routes in New England, ran along a trail used by native peoples for generations before the English arrived. The Albany Post Road, which would become one of the most important arteries of colonial New York, followed a Lenape path along the Hudson Valley. The road that would eventually become the Boston Post Road, the most storied post road in American history, began as a series of indigenous trails connecting the coastal villages of southern New England. There is something worth sitting with in that knowledge. The routes that would carry the news of the American Revolution, that would carry the first official mail of the new nation, that would carry the stagecoaches and the politicians and the merchants of the colonial era, those routes were laid down not by English surveyors or royal proclamation, but by the footsteps of people who had known this land for thousands of years before anyone in London had imagined that this continent existed. The road was already there. It had always been there, in a sense. It was just waiting for a different kind of traveler. In the earliest years of the English colonies, travel overland was genuinely difficult in a way that is hard to fully imagine from the vantage of the present. The paths were narrow, often barely wide enough for a single person on foot. They flooded in spring, turned to deep mud in autumn rains, froze into ruts in winter. Fallen trees blocked them after storms. The bridges, where they existed at all, were crude affairs of logs laid side by side, treacherous when wet, liable to wash away in freshets. A journey that today takes 2 hours by car might have taken a week on foot in the 1630s. Not because the land was dangerous in a dramatic way, colonial travel narratives rarely speak of bears or wolves attacking travelers, though such encounters were possible, but simply because every mile required effort. Every hill was a genuine hill. Every river crossing was a genuine problem. Every night required shelter, and shelter on the road was uncertain. And yet people traveled. Constantly, and more than you might expect. Merchants carried goods between towns. Ministers rode circuits between congregations. Magistrates traveled to hold court. Farmers walked to market. Women traveled to visit family, to attend births and deaths, to nurse the sick. Soldiers marched. Refugees moved. The colonial world was not a world of people rooted in one spot, never venturing beyond their own village. It was, from the very beginning, a world in motion. It was that constant motion, and the needs that came with it, the need for reliable routes, for news, for correspondence, for the movement of goods and people across the length of the colonies, that would eventually demand something more organized than a network of widened indigenous trails. It would demand a postal system. And with it, roads. But that story begins slowly, as most important stories do. It begins with a man carrying a leather bag, on horseback, alone, riding through a winter forest before dawn. And we will come to that man, and to the road he rode, very soon. Part 2: The First Riders, Post and Mail in the Early Colonies. There is an image that keeps returning when you read the early histories of the colonial postal system. A single rider. A dirt path through bare winter trees. A leather satchel slung over one shoulder, sealed against the weather. The horse's breath making small clouds in the cold air. And somewhere ahead, still hours away, the faint candlelit windows of the next settlement. That image, solitary, unhurried, essential, is really where the story of the American postal road begins. The word post, in the sense of a mail system, comes from an old European tradition. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the great monarchies of Europe, England, France, Spain, had developed postal networks along their main roads. These networks operated by placing relay stations, called posts, at regular intervals along the road. A rider would carry dispatches from one post to the next, hand the mail off to a fresh rider and a fresh horse, and the packet of letters would continue on its way without waiting for any single horse to rest. This system, the post system, allowed information to move much faster than any single rider could travel. In England, the Royal Mail was a serious institution by the early 17th century. It carried the king's correspondence, official government dispatches, and eventually, with some reluctance on the part of the crown, private letters as well. The colonies that England planted along the American coast in the first half of the 17th century had no such system. They were too new, too scattered, too far from London for the Royal Mail to reach. Communication between the colonies relied entirely on private arrangements, a merchant sending a letter by a ship's captain, a traveler carrying a packet of correspondence as a favor, a servant or enslaved person dispatched with a message on foot. It was informal, unreliable, and slow. A letter sent from Boston to New York might take weeks to arrive, if it arrived at all. A letter sent to the southern colonies from New England might take months. The first formal attempt to establish a colonial postal service came, perhaps surprisingly, not from London but from the colonies themselves. For decades, the problem of overland mail traveling between the colonies themselves, rather than between the colonies in England, remained essentially unsolved. Each colony managed its own affairs with little coordination with its neighbors. The roads between them were poor or non-existent. There was no agreed system of payment, no official riders, no network of relay stations. That route between New York and Boston would become the backbone of the colonial postal system. But in 1673, it was still barely a road. The rider who traveled it traversed forests and river crossings with no infrastructure to support him, no relay stations, no guarantee of shelter or assistance along the way. He was simply a man on a horse, carrying a bag, making his way as best he could through whatever weather and terrain the land offered. His name is not recorded. We do not know what he looked like, or exactly he slept, which Fords gave him trouble in those first months of service. He passed through history without leaving much of a trace. And yet he was, in his anonymous and practical way, doing something that mattered enormously. He was creating the habit of connection. He was teaching the colonies that regular, reliable communication between them was possible. The monthly service between New York and Boston continued through the 1670s and into the 1680s, slowly becoming more regular and more organized. But it was not until 1691 that the British Crown took direct interest in establishing a colonial postal system. In that year, King William III granted a royal patent to a man named Thomas Neal, authorizing him to establish a general post office for the American colonies. Neal himself never came to America. He appointed a deputy, Andrew Hamilton of New Jersey, to handle the actual work of building the system. Hamilton was a shrewd and energetic administrator, and under his management, the Colonial Postal Service took on something closer to its eventual shape. Hamilton established post offices in the major towns of the northern colonies. He organized regular rider services along the main routes. He set rates for the carriage of letters, based on distance and the number of sheets of paper. Since envelopes did not exist, letters were folded into packets and the number of folds determined the weight and therefore the cost. These postal rates were not cheap by the standards of the day. Sending a single-sheet letter between Philadelphia and New York cost 9 pence. Sending the same letter from Philadelphia to Boston cost 18 pence. For ordinary working people, this was a significant expense, equivalent to half a day's wages for a laborer. The postal system in its early years was largely a tool of merchants, officials, and the relatively prosperous. Ordinary people communicated by other means, by having travelers carry word of mouth, by sending messages with neighbors who happened to be going the right direction. But the system was growing. Slowly, haltingly, with many reversals and difficulties, but growing. And as the Postal Service grew, the roads it traveled were growing with it. Because one of the unexpected effects of the postal system was that it created pressure for road improvement. Once there was a regular schedule, a rider expected to make the journey between Boston and New York in a certain number of days, there was an incentive to improve the route. Bridges were built where there had been only fords. Difficult passages were improved. Milestones began to appear along the road, marking distances so that riders and travelers could know where they were and how far they had to go. The road was becoming something. Not yet comfortable. Not yet fast. But it was becoming a road in the fullest sense, a route with a name, a purpose, a rhythm, a community of people who depended on it and maintained it and thought of it as part of the landscape of their lives. And in the first years of the 18th century, something else was about to happen along that road that would change it forever. A woman was going to ride it. Alone. In the middle of winter. From New Haven to New York and back. Her name was Sarah Kemble Knight. And she left behind a diary. Part 3, Madam Knight Rides the Post Road. There is a specific evening in early October of 1704 that Sarah Kemble Knight recorded in her journal, and it is worth dwelling on, because she wrote about it in a way that makes it feel very present. She had left Boston the day before on a journey south, a legal errand involving the estate of a deceased relative that would take her all the way to New Haven and then to New York. She was traveling a route along what was then called the Boston Post Road, and she was doing something that even in 1704 was considered somewhat remarkable. She was traveling it alone, without a male escort, relying on the hospitality of strangers and the guidance of whatever post rider or local guide she could engage along the way. Sarah Kemble Knight was 38 years old. She was a widow, or at least, her husband was away, who ran a writing school and a boarding house in Boston, and who was accustomed to managing her own affairs. She was literate, sharp, observant, often funny, and entirely unafraid of recording her opinions, which were sometimes flattering and sometimes not, about the places and people she encountered. On that first evening, she wrote, she found herself riding along a dark road through a dense wood, following a post rider whose name she does not give, trying to keep her horse close behind his so as not to lose the path. The moon was hidden by clouds. The trees pressed close on both sides. The road, if it could be called that, was muddy from recent rain, and her horse's feet sank and slipped with each step. She wrote that she was frightened. Not of any specific danger, but of the darkness itself, and of the strangeness of being alone in it, and of the uncertainty of what lay ahead. And then she wrote something that has stayed with readers ever since, that she looked up through a gap in the trees and saw the moon break suddenly through the clouds, and that its light fell on the wet road ahead and made it look almost silver, and that she felt, in that moment, something she could only describe as a kind of strange comfort. That moment, the frightened woman, the dark road, the sudden moonlight captures something essential about the experience of travel on the Colonial Post Road. It was not comfortable. It was not safe in the easy modern sense. But it had its moments of unexpected beauty, and it demanded from its travelers a kind of presence, a kind of attention to the immediate world around them, that our faster modes of travel have mostly taken away. Sarah Knight's journey from Boston to New York took her about 2 weeks. The return journey, in January, took somewhat longer because of winter conditions. In that time she crossed rivers by canoe with her horse swimming alongside, slept in inns that she described with varying degrees of charity, some clean and comfortable, others smoky and loud and furnished with beds she would rather not have lain in, ate meals of varying quality, hired a series of local guides to navigate difficult passages, and wrote it all down with a wit and precision that makes her account one of the most vivid documents we have of colonial road travel. She recorded the landscape in detail. The long flat stretches of coastal marsh near the Connecticut shore, where the road ran across improvised causeways and the salt smell was sharp in the air. The dark pine barrens of Rhode Island, where the trees grew close and the light was always dim even at midday. The sudden appearance of well-farmed land around the established towns, New Haven, Saybrook, New London, where the clearings opened up and the road widened in the sound of bells from a church or a school carried from somewhere nearby. She recorded the people she met. Farmers who gave her directions with great confidence and were frequently wrong. An innkeeper's wife who sat by the fire spinning and would not speak. A young minister who rode with her for half a day and talked almost continuously about theology. Local post riders who knew every turn of the road and moved through the landscape with a casual ease that she clearly admired. She recorded the inns. The Colonial Inn, or Ordinary, as it was sometimes called, was the crucial infrastructure of road travel. Without inns, the road would have been impassable for any but the most self-sufficient travelers. An inn provided food, drink, a bed, and stabling for horses. At its best, it was warm and clean and the food was good and the company was lively. At its worst, it was crowded and dirty and the food was questionable and you slept in a room with several strangers and hoped for the best. Madam Knight, this is how she is often referred to by historians, using the courtesy title given to married women of her social standing, encountered both kinds. One inn she described as having a very convenient house and good entertainment, where the hostess was capable and the roast was excellent and she slept well. Another she described in terms that are polite but unmistakable in their disdain: a smoky room, a bed not to be laid on for the stir, a dinner that she ate mostly out of hunger rather than pleasure. But she kept writing. Day after day, through Connecticut and into New York, she kept writing. When she reached New York, which she found a lively and diverse city, full of Dutch influences still visible in the architecture and the manners of the older families, she was there for several months, attending to her legal business, before returning north in the January cold. The return journey was harder. The road that had been merely muddy in October was now frozen, with deep ruts that could lame a horse if it stepped wrong. River crossings that had been manageable in autumn were now either frozen solid, which could be crossed on the ice if the ice held, or running with cold fast water around broken ice floes, which was genuinely dangerous. She wrote of crossing one Connecticut river on ice that creaked and shifted under her horse, and of the particular quality of fear that comes from knowing that the ground beneath you is unreliable. And yet she crossed it. And she arrived home. And she wrote it all down. Sarah Kemble Knight's journal was not published until 1825, more than a century after she wrote it. But when it was finally published, it immediately became recognized as something valuable, a first-person account of the colonial road from someone who had no official role, no political agenda, no reason to describe it as anything other than what it actually was. What it was, she showed, was a world unto itself. The road had its own community, the writers and innkeepers and guides and ferrymen who made it function. It had its own rhythms, its own dangers, its own unexpected pleasures. It was, in a very real sense, one of the places where colonial America was most itself, diverse, improvised, relying on the goodwill of strangers, moving always toward something. We owe her a debt, that woman on the dark road with the moonlight on the silver mud ahead of her. She saw the Colonial Post Road clearly, and she told us what she saw. But the story of the road was only beginning. Because shortly after Madam Knight's journey, the man who would shape the colonial postal system more than any other, and who would spend much of his life thinking about roads and communication and the movement of information, was beginning his career. His name, of course, was Benjamin Franklin. Part 4: Franklin and the Roads of Empire. There is something about Benjamin Franklin that tends to overwhelm the details of his life. He becomes the kite, the key, the lightning bolt. He becomes the fur cap in Paris. He becomes the face on the $100 bill. But before all of that, before the diplomacy and the science and the statesmanship, he was a printer in Philadelphia, and a man who thought very carefully about how information moved through the world. Franklin understood, in a way that few of his contemporaries did, that communication was the nervous system of a functioning society. He understood that a letter delayed was a decision delayed, a merchant disadvantaged, a relationship strained, a community weakened. He understood that the speed and reliability of the mail was not a trivial administrative matter but something fundamental to the health of the colonial enterprise. He came to this understanding partly through his own experience. As the owner and operator of the Pennsylvania Gazette and later as the organizer of a network of printing partnerships across several colonies, Franklin was acutely aware of how much depended on reliable communication. He needed to receive news from London and from other colonial centers. He needed to exchange correspondence with printers and business partners in other cities. Every week that a letter sat delayed in a post office or was lost when a post writer chose a wrong route was a week that cost him money and opportunity. In 1737, Franklin was appointed postmaster of Philadelphia, and he threw himself into the role with his characteristic combination of practical intelligence and systematic thinking. He reorganized the Philadelphia post office, introduced clear bookkeeping, made the operations more transparent. He began to think about how the system as a whole, not just Philadelphia, but the entire colonial network, could be improved. Then, in 1753, the British Crown appointed Franklin as one of two joint deputy postmasters general for North America, the chief postal officials for all the colonies. He held this post, with enormous energy and considerable success, until 1774, when the British government dismissed him in the tense aftermath of the political crisis over the Hutchinson letters. During those 20 years, Franklin transformed the colonial postal system. And much of that transformation had to do with roads. When Franklin took office in 1753, the postal service between the major colonial cities operated on a roughly bi-weekly schedule in summer and a monthly schedule in winter. Letters moved slowly, and the time between sending and receiving a reply across any significant distance could easily run to several months. This made the mail less useful for business. By the time you received an answer to a commercial inquiry, the market might have changed entirely, and it limited the role of the postal service in the daily life of the colonies. Franklin's first act was to travel the roads himself. This is one of the things about Franklin that tends to get lost in the larger biography, that he was, in the years of his postal administration, a genuinely energetic traveler. He rode the post roads. He inspected the post offices. He spoke with the writers and the innkeepers and the local postmasters and the merchants who depended on the service. He wanted to understand the system not as an abstraction but as a physical reality, as a set of roads and people and horses and schedules that either worked or didn't. What he found was a system in considerable disorder. Post offices kept poor records. Writers took inconsistent routes. There was no reliable way to track whether a letter had been received. The accounting was chaotic. Franklin discovered that many local postmasters had been pocketing postal revenue rather than passing it on to the crown, not always from dishonesty but often simply because the accounting system was too unclear for anyone to know what was owed. He set about fixing these problems one by one, with the methodical patience that characterized his best work. He standardized accounting practices. He introduced systematic record-keeping. He required that writers maintain logs of their journeys, noting departure times and arrival times at each post office along the route. And he improved the roads. Or rather, he worked with the colonial governments and the crown to improve the roads along the postal routes. New bridges were built. Difficult river crossings were improved. The milestones that marked the Boston Post Road, some of which can still be found today, their inscriptions worn but still legible, were systematically placed under Franklin's administration, giving travelers and writers a reliable way to measure their progress. Franklin also accelerated the schedule. By reorganizing writer routes and relay stations, he reduced the time it took a letter to travel between Philadelphia and New York from roughly 2 days to 1. The service between New York and Boston, which had taken the better part of a week, was reduced to 3 days in summer. For the first time, the Colonial Postal Service became genuinely competitive with private carrier services, which had previously been faster and more reliable than the official mail. The effect was remarkable. As the Postal Service became more reliable and faster, people used it more. More letters were sent, more business was conducted by correspondence, more connections were made between communities that had previously been in only occasional contact. Franklin had understood what the administrators before him had missed, that the Postal Service was not simply a revenue-generating enterprise for the Crown, but an infrastructure, and that infrastructure improves with use. There is a way in which the Colonial Post Road, by the middle of the 18th century, was functioning as something analogous to what we would now call a communications network. The road itself was the infrastructure. The writers were the carriers. The post offices were the nodes. And what flowed through this network, letters, newspapers, pamphlets, commercial correspondence, political argument, was the intellectual and economic life of the colonies. Franklin saw this clearly. He saw that whoever controlled the post road controlled, in some meaningful sense, the flow of information that held the colonial world together. And he worked, through his 20 years as Deputy Postmaster General, to make that network as open, as fast, and as reliable as he could manage. When the British government dismissed him in 1774, they did not fully reckon with what they were doing. They thought they were removing a troublesome official. They did not realize they were releasing him to help build something new. Because within a year, Benjamin Franklin would be helping to design a postal system for a country that did not yet officially exist. And the roads he had spent decades improving would carry the dispatches of a revolution. But before we reach the revolution, we should slow down and spend some time with the road itself. Not the political history of the road, or the administrative history, but the physical reality of it. The mud and the milestones and the inns and the river crossings. The daily life of the post road. That is where the real history lies. Part 5, the road itself, surface, season, and the texture of travel. If you were to stand on the Boston Post Road in the year 1740, somewhere between, say, New Haven and New York, in a stretch of road that ran through mixed forest and small cleared farmsteads, what would you see? First, the road itself. It was narrow. Between 12 and 18 feet wide in most places, which sounds reasonable until you consider that two wagons meeting each other on that road could barely pass without one of them pulling off onto the shoulder. The surface was unpaved. There would be no macadam or gravel-paved road surfaces in America for another several decades, which meant it was simply earth, compacted by the passage of hooves and wheels over time. After a dry summer, that compacted earth could be quite firm and pleasant to travel on. The surface was dusty but relatively smooth, and a horse could make good time. After a wet autumn, it became something else entirely. The wheels of wagons and coaches dug down through the thin crust into the soft clay beneath, leaving deep parallel ruts that then dried hard over winter, so that the road in spring was a kind of frozen chaos of angular ridges and holes. Spring was universally acknowledged by colonial travelers as the worst time to travel overland. The poets of the colonial era, and there were more of them than you might expect, though most of their verse is not much read today, wrote about spring mud with real feeling. It was not the romantic mud of pastoral poetry but a genuine obstacle, capable of stopping a loaded wagon entirely, of swallowing a horse's leg up to the knee, of reducing a day's journey to a mile or two of exhausting effort. Summer travel was easier, though it brought its own challenges: heat and dust, flies and mosquitoes in the lowland stretches near rivers and marshes, the occasional sudden thunderstorm that could turn a dry road into a muddy stream within an hour. But in summer the days were long and the roads were at their best, and this was when most commercial travel took place: the merchants and their wagons, the itinerant traders and craftsmen, the circuit riders. Autumn was a beautiful time to travel, according to almost every account we have, and there are many. The light changed in the forest, turning the maple and oak to gold and orange and deep red. The air cooled. The mud dried. The harvest meant that inns along the road were well supplied with food, and the general mood of the countryside was one of relative prosperity and satisfaction. Even experienced travelers who wrote mostly of discomfort and difficulty tended to write warmly of autumn journeys. Winter was divided into two kinds. There was deep winter, when the ground was frozen solid and covered with snow, and which was actually, somewhat counterintuitively, quite good for heavy travel. Frozen ground bore weight well. Sleighs ran smoothly over packed snow in ways that wheeled vehicles never could on a muddy road. Some heavy freight that could not be moved in summer, because the roads were too soft, was routinely scheduled for winter transport, when the cold earth provided a temporary firmness. Then there was the in-between time, the thaw in late February or early March, when the surface ice melted and the water had nowhere to go because the soil beneath was still frozen. This was the worst mud of all, deeper and more persistent than anything the autumn rains produced, and it could effectively close the main roads for weeks. The post riders were expected to travel in all seasons, and they did. Their contracts specified that the mail must go through regardless of weather, and with very few exceptions, it did. But the riders had the advantage of traveling on horseback rather than by carriage or wagon. A horse alone could go where a wheeled vehicle could not, could ford streams that a loaded wagon would find impassable, could pick its way along a road rendered nearly invisible by snow. But between the settlements, the forest came back. Not the original old-growth forest, much of that had already been cleared or harvested, but a younger, thinner forest, growing back on land that had been cleared and then abandoned or allowed to revert. Traveling the post road between towns, you move through this alternating landscape, open farmland around houses, then a stretch of forest, then another clearing, then more trees. The forest stretches could be quite long. Between New Haven and New York, for example, there were sections of the road that ran through several miles of continuous woodland without a farm or house in sight. At night, these stretches were genuinely dark. The moon and stars provided some light, but a cloudy night in a Connecticut forest in 1740 was very dark indeed by any standard we would recognize. This is why the post riders often carried lanterns. A small oil lantern hung from the saddle, not really bright enough to illuminate the road much beyond the horse's immediate feet, but enough to reassure the rider that there was a road, that the darkness was not entirely absolute. The lantern swayed with the horse's motion, casting little moving pools of warm orange light on the dirt or the snow. The inns along the road were widely spaced in some stretches, close together in others. Around the larger towns, there might be 2 or 3 inns within a few miles of each other, competing for the same travelers. In the longer rural stretches, a single inn might serve a territory of 20 or 30 miles, and travelers planned their days around reaching it before dark. The typical inn along the post road was a substantial 2-story building, usually of wood frame construction, with a large common room on the ground floor dominated by a fireplace that could accommodate logs 4 feet long. Around this fire, on cold evenings, the company gathered, travelers, locals who came for a drink and the news, the innkeeper and his family, sometimes a post rider resting before the next stage of his journey. The fire was the center of everything. The food was cooked on it. The room was heated by it. The light in the evening was partly from it, supplemented by tallow candles that smelled faintly of animal fat as they burned. Guests sat close to the fire in the chairs and settles arranged around it, and they talked about the road, about the news, about the weather, about the price of goods, about who had died and who had been born, about politics when the conversation turned that way. For many travelers, the inn was not just a place to eat and sleep. It was the primary place where they encountered the wider world. A merchant stopping at an inn in Fairfield, Connecticut might learn from another traveler that the price of flour had risen in New York, or that there was illness in a particular town and it would be wise to route around it. He might hear news from London brought by a ship captain who had landed that week at New Haven and was heading inland. He might meet someone from Philadelphia who had information about a business contact. The inn was a place of information exchange as much as a place of rest. The post riders were particularly important in this regard. They traveled the road constantly, in both directions, and they absorbed news from every inn and post office they visited. A writer who had just come from Boston might know that there had been a fire in the North End, that the price of fish had changed, that a particular ship had arrived from London with news from Parliament. A writer coming from New York might know that there was ice on the Hudson, making river travel difficult, or that the governor had made some new proclamation. Before newspapers were widely available along the length of the road, and for the poorer and more remote communities, newspapers remained scarce throughout the colonial period. The post riders were the primary bearers of news. People listened to them carefully when they stopped at an inn or a post office, and the riders, aware of their role, often took some pleasure in delivering news, dramatically lingering over the interesting details, pausing for effect, enjoying the attention of the assembled room. There was, in this, something of the oral tradition that had always governed the movement of news in pre-literate communities. The post-writer as newsbearer was not so different, in function, from the messenger figures of ancient societies, the herald, the bard, the traveling monk carrying word of events from distant places. The medium was different. The horse was different. But the essential human exchange was the same, someone who had traveled further than the rest telling the stay-at-homes what they had seen. And the road they traveled, that narrow, muddy, lantern-lit road running through the patchwork landscape of colonial New England, was the medium through which all of this flowed. Part 6, The Post-Writers, Men of the Road. We know the names of some of them, though the historical record is incomplete in the way that records of working people almost always are. John Perry, William Doyne, Ebenezer Brack. These are men who appear in the postal records of the early 18th century, listed as post-writers on the Boston to New York route. They received small salaries, substantially less than a skilled craftsman would earn, plus the right to carry private letters on their own account and charge small fees for that service. The official salary barely covered their expenses. The private letter business was what made the job worth doing. The post-writer's life was physically demanding in ways that are easy to underestimate. He rode regardless of weather. He was expected to maintain a schedule that the Colonial Road, with its seasonal variations and unpredictable conditions, constantly conspired to disrupt. He carried official mail, which could include documents of considerable legal or political importance, carefully sealed in leather satchels, as well as private letters and sometimes small packages of a confidential nature. He was personally responsible for the mail he carried. If letters went missing from his bag, he was liable. If he was late without good cause, he could be fined. The regulations of the Colonial Postal Service, particularly after Franklin's reforms of the 1750s, were quite specific about what a writer was and was not permitted to do, and writers who violated them faced real consequences. At the same time, the writer had a degree of freedom that many colonial workers did not. He spent his days outdoors, moving through the landscape. He was his own boss in a practical sense. No one was watching him as he rode, checking whether he stopped too long at an inn or whether he chose a slightly different route than the prescribed one. He saw more of the colonial world than almost anyone else of his social class. He knew the road in a way that even regular travelers did not, because he traveled it in all seasons and all weathers, year after year. The routes were long. The main Boston Post Road, from Boston to New York, was approximately 250 miles by the routes most commonly used. A post writer making this journey was expected to cover it in about 4 or 5 days in good summer conditions, though the actual time varied considerably. This meant averaging 50 or more miles per day, which required not just riding but knowing when to push the horse and when to rest it, knowing which sections of the road demanded care and which allowed a faster pace, knowing the inns and stabling facilities along the way well enough to plan each day's journey accordingly. The writers used relay systems on some routes, particularly in later years and on the busiest routes. Under a relay system, a writer would travel only one section of the route, perhaps 30 or 40 miles, before handing the mail bag off to the next writer, who would carry it the next section. This allowed the mail to move continuously without requiring any single horse to travel the entire distance. But on less busy routes, and in the earlier period of the Colonial Postal Service, a single writer often made the entire journey himself, over several days. The horse was everything. A post rider's horse needed to be sound, capable of sustained effort over rough roads, and reliable in the various alarming situations that road travel presented. The sudden movement of deer from the forest, the unexpected appearance of another rider around a blind curve, the challenge of ice or deep mud or a ford that was running higher than expected. Riders who could afford to maintain a good horse were more successful than those who could not, because a lame horse could strand you a day's ride from the next post office, with a mailbag full of official correspondence that was already late. There is a particular category of account that appears repeatedly in the history of the Colonial Post Road, the rider who arrived at a river crossing to find it impassable. Rivers were the great obstacles of the colonial road system. They could be crossed by several means: ford, walking the horse through, if the water was not too deep or too fast; ferry, a flat-bottomed boat or raft propelled by poles or oars, operated by a ferryman who expected to be paid; or bridge, where one existed, which along many routes it did not. Each of these options had its season. A ford that was safe in August might be chest-deep and fast in April. A ferry that operated reliably in summer might be frozen out of service in January. A wooden bridge might be washed away by a spring flood and not yet rebuilt. Post riders developed extensive local knowledge of every crossing on their routes. They knew which ferrymen were reliable and which were likely to be drunk on a cold morning. They knew which fords were safe and what depth of water and which had deceptive currents or soft bottoms that could trap a horse. They knew which bridges were sound and which had been in questionable condition since the flood of a particular year, and how far to trust them with a full-grown horse. When a crossing was genuinely impossible, as occasionally happened, the rider had to make a decision. Wait for conditions to change, which might mean hours or days. Find an alternative route, which might add many miles. Or attempt the crossing anyway, accepting the risk. The historical record contains several accounts of riders who made the third choice and paid for it with a swim in cold water, or worse. Franklin, when he took over the postal administration, worked to standardize the portmanteaus used by riders on the major routes, ensuring they were properly made and maintained. It was the kind of small practical detail that characterized his approach to administration, invisible when it worked, but enormously consequential to the person waiting for a letter that arrived readable rather than a wet illegible mass. Some of the post riders became notable figures in their communities. Not famous in the wider sense, but known and respected locally in the way that anyone is respected who does a difficult job reliably and well. They were the people who brought news, who carried the letters that connected families across the distances that colonial life imposed, who arrived at the post office on schedule in conditions that might have given a less determined person excellent reason to stay home. They were trusted, in the deep and practical sense that trust is built through consistent action over time. Their names are mostly lost to us. We know the system they served, the road they rode, the schedules they maintained. We know the system they were part of in its broad outlines. But the individual human stories, the particular cold morning when a particular rider decided to cross a particular river despite his better judgment, the evening a rider sat by the fire at a Fairfield Inn and heard news from New York that he knew would matter to the people waiting for him in Boston, those stories are gone. They were never considered important enough to record. History has a way of preserving the frame while losing the painting. We have the regulations and the account books and the administrative correspondence. We have Franklin's letters about the Postal Service, which are detailed and illuminating. We have a few travelers' accounts, like Madam Knight's, that describe what the road and the inns and the riders looked like from the outside. But we do not have, with very few exceptions, the writer's own account. What it felt like to be alone on a dark road in February with a bag full of other people's correspondence and the next in still 4 miles away. We can only imagine it. And in imagining it, perhaps, we can hold some small piece of that experience: the cold, the lantern, the sound of hooves on frozen ground, the horse's steady breathing in the dark. Part 7: The Roads Between, Connecting the Colonies. When we speak of the Colonial Post Road, we tend to speak of the Boston Post Road, the spine of the system, the route between the two largest cities of British North America. But there were other roads, running in other directions, and they tell their own stories. The road between Philadelphia and New York, sometimes called the King's Highway in the colonial period, though that name was applied somewhat loosely to various roads at various times, was one of the busiest routes in the colonies by the middle of the 18th century. Philadelphia had grown into the largest city in British North America by the 1750s, surpassing Boston in population and commercial importance. The road between Philadelphia and New York was accordingly busy with merchants and their wagons, with travelers of every kind, with post riders and official dispatches. This road passed through the fertile farmland of eastern New Jersey, the rolling agricultural landscape between the Delaware River and the Hudson, which was by 1750 among the most productive agricultural land in the colonies. The farms along this route were well established and prosperous, and the inns and taverns that served the road were accordingly comfortable. Travelers on this stretch typically wrote more favorably about their accommodations than those on the rougher sections further north. South of Philadelphia, the road network was different in character and in history. The colonial settlements of Maryland and Virginia were older than most people realize. Jamestown was founded in 1607, Maryland in 1634, but they had developed in a different pattern from the New England and Middle colonies. Instead of concentrated towns with farmland around them, the tobacco-growing colonies of the Chesapeake developed a more dispersed pattern, with large plantations spread along river valleys, connected to each other and to the outside world primarily by water rather than by road. The rivers of the Chesapeake, the Potomac, the Rappahannock, the York, the James, were the highways of the tobacco economy. Hogsheads of cured tobacco were rolled down to river landings, loaded onto flat-bottomed boats, and transported by water to the coastal ports where ocean-going ships waited. The roads in this region, in the early colonial period, were often inferior to those in the north, precisely because the river system provided a more reliable alternative. But as the tobacco economy grew and the population spread further inland away from the prime river accessible land and into the Piedmont, roads became more necessary. By the early 18th century, a loose network of roads connected the major tobacco ports with the growing interior settlements of Virginia and Maryland, and the Postal Service extended its reach along these routes, though the service was less regular and less reliable than in the north. Further south still, in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, the road network was even more primitive. These were younger colonies, more thinly settled, with more challenging terrain in places, the vast coastal plain with its swamps and rivers, the sandhills of the interior, the forests of longleaf pine that stretched for hundreds of miles. Travel in the colonial Carolinas was, by most contemporary accounts, genuinely difficult, and the postal service was sporadic at best. There is a remarkable account from the early 18th century of a Swiss traveler named Johann David Schopf who traveled through the southern colonies and wrote extensively about the roads he encountered. He described the roads of North Carolina, in particular, as among the worst he had seen anywhere, tracks through forest and swamp that could barely be called roads at all, where a traveler might go miles without seeing a house or meeting another person on the way. And yet people lived there, and traveled there, and connected with each other, and with the wider colonial world. The post rider who served the southern routes was doing something arguably more difficult than his counterpart on the Boston Post Road. He was maintaining a thread of connection through a landscape that had not yet developed the infrastructure to support it. The post roads of the colonial period also had an important function that is easy to overlook. They connected not just cities with each other, but the interior with the coast. By the early 18th century, settlers were pushing steadily westward from the coastal settlements, up into the Appalachian foothills and valleys. These interior settlers, farmers, mainly, but also craftsmen and merchants and the occasional minister, were often days or weeks from the nearest established town. Their connection to the wider world, to the markets and the government and the culture of the colonial centers, depended on roads. The Great Philadelphia Wagon Road, sometimes called the Great Wagon Road, was the most significant of these interior routes. It ran from Philadelphia southwestward along the Great Appalachian Valley, following the natural corridor between the Appalachian Ridges, through the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, into the Carolinas. By the mid-18th century it was carrying enormous numbers of settlers, German immigrants, Scots-Irish immigrants, and migrants from the older coastal settlements, all moving southwest along this great natural highway. The Great Wagon Road was not a post road in the formal sense, but it carried post riders and mail along its length, and it was one of the most heavily traveled routes in British North America. Towns grew along it: Winchester, Staunton, Roanoke, Salem, as the settlers moving along the road found places they wanted to stop and build. The road itself was shaped by the Appalachian geology as much as by human decision. The Valley of Virginia, through which much of its length ran, is a remarkable landscape, a long, relatively flat corridor between the Blue Ridge to the east and the Allegheny Front to the west, with a gentle southward gradient that made travel relatively easy compared to crossing the mountains on either side. The indigenous peoples had used this corridor for thousands of years. The great warrior path of the Cherokee and the Iroquois ran along essentially the same route. The Great Wagon Road simply made explicit what the landscape had always suggested, that this was the way through. As you follow any of these roads in your imagination, the Boston Post Road along the Connecticut shore, the Kings Highway through New Jersey, the Great Wagon Road down the Valley of Virginia, you are following something that the land itself, in some sense, suggested. The road is always a negotiation between human purpose and natural form. The colonial road makers, like the indigenous trail makers before them, were reading the landscape and translating what it told them into lines on the earth. Those lines are still there, in many cases. The interstate highways and state routes and county roads of the modern American road network follow, more often than you might think, the same corridors that colonial roads used, which followed indigenous trails, which followed the movement of animals, which followed the ridges and valleys and river courses that the geology of the continent laid down hundreds of millions of years ago. There is a very long memory in the land, if you know how to read it. Part 8, Taverns, Ordinaries, and the Social Life of the Road. The inn had many names in colonial America. It was called an ordinary, a tavern, an alehouse, a public house, a house of entertainment. The names carried slightly different connotations depending on region and period, but they all referred to the same essential institution, a place where travelers could find food, drink, lodging, and company. The Colonial Inn was not simply a business. It was a social institution of the first importance, in a society that had few other gathering places outside the church and the courthouse. In the towns along the Post Road, the tavern was where the community's informal business was conducted. It was where men, and it was mostly men, in the public rooms, gathered to hear news, to argue about politics, to conduct commercial negotiations, to settle disputes, to celebrate and to mourn. The licensing of taverns was closely regulated by colonial governments, because they were understood to be important public institutions rather than merely private businesses. A tavern license required the keeper to maintain his establishment in good order, to charge regulated prices for basic commodities, to refuse service to drunkards and troublemakers, and to provide adequate accommodation for travelers. In practice, enforcement of these regulations was inconsistent, but the underlying understanding was clear: the tavern had public responsibilities. The tavern keepers along the post road were often among the most connected people in their communities. They heard news from every traveler who stopped, from every post rider who rested at their tables. They extended credit to regular customers and negotiated terms with occasional ones. They knew the state of the road ahead because every traveler who arrived from that direction had just come over it. Some tavern keepers became locally famous. Their establishments became known by their names: Brintnells, Bissell's, Tomlinson's, and travelers planned their journeys around reaching particular inns that they had heard well of, or avoiding ones they had heard ill of. The tavern's reputation traveled the road in both directions, carried by the same post riders and merchants who carried everything else. The typical evening at a post-road tavern in the mid-18th century was something like this. In the common room, which might be 20 feet square or somewhat larger, the central fireplace was burning large logs, and the fire maintained by the innkeeper's family throughout the day. A half-dozen or more travelers might be present: a merchant heading south with samples of his goods, a minister returning from a pastoral visit, a young man looking for work who was moving toward the city, a farmer who had come in from the surrounding countryside for a drink and the news. The post rider from New York had arrived an hour ago, delivered his bag to the local postmaster, and was now sitting by the fire eating a late supper before taking a room for the night. The food was hearty and plain. Roast meat pork was most common, though beef and mutton appeared depending on the season and the region, served with bread and boiled vegetables. Pies were common. Cider was the standard drink in New England, ale or beer in the middle colonies. Rum was available everywhere and was consumed in quantities that would surprise modern sensibilities, though colonial drunkenness was a real enough problem that the tavern regulations mentioned above were partly aimed at controlling it. The conversation ranged freely. News from the road, the state of the crossing at such and such a river, the price of goods in the city, the latest developments in whatever political dispute was current, mixed with local gossip and personal accounts of travels past. The minister might tell a story about a remarkable sermon he had heard. The merchant might describe an unusual cargo he had seen at the docks. Someone would ask the post rider about conditions on the road north, and he would answer between bites of his supper, happy to be listened to. Upstairs, the sleeping arrangements were simple. Beds were larger and fewer than we might expect. A common arrangement was for 2 or more travelers to share a bed, which was perfectly normal by the social standards of the period and is only strange from the perspective of a later culture that has thoroughly privatized sleep. The sheets were cleaner in some inns than others. Blankets were provided in varying quantities and conditions. A chamber pot under the bed served the nighttime necessities. The room was unheated unless the traveler paid extra for a fire in the room's small fireplace, which many travelers chose not to do and instead slept in their clothes against the cold. The quality of sleep available at a colonial inn was not, by most accounts, particularly restorative. The beds were often infested with fleas and sometimes worse. The rooms were shared with snoring strangers. The walls between rooms were thin, and conversations in neighboring rooms were audible. Dogs wandered the premises. Horses in the stable below made their own contributions to the soundscape. And yet travelers valued the inns enormously, precisely because the alternative was to sleep outdoors or in whatever other shelter might be found, a barn, a farmhouse where a farmer's wife might offer a pallet in the kitchen, or simply under a tree. Compared to these options, even an imperfect inn with its fleas and its noise offered something precious: a roof, a fire, a meal, and the company of other people in a landscape that could otherwise feel very large and very empty. The inns also served a function that is easy to overlook: they were credit institutions. Travelers often did not have cash in hand for every expense of a journey. They ran tabs at inns, promising to pay on the return trip, or arranged for bills to be sent to their employers or business partners. The innkeeper extended credit based on reputation, a recommendation from a known traveler, a letter of introduction, or simply the judgment of one human being about another. This credit network, informal but extensive, was part of what made long-distance travel possible in a period before banks and credit cards. The road worked because there was a web of trust running along it, maintained by the people who lived on the road and knew its travelers. When that trust was violated, when a traveler skipped out on a bill, or when a fraudster used false letters of introduction to obtain credit he had no intention of repaying, it was a serious matter. News of such violations traveled the road quickly. An innkeeper in New Haven who had been cheated would send word to his counterparts in New York and Hartford, and the fraudster who thought he had made a clean escape might find his name known before he arrived at the next inn. The community of the road was real. It was not a formal community, not organized or institutionalized. But it was real in the way that any community based on shared experience and mutual dependence is real. The people of the post road, the writers and the innkeepers and the regular travelers and the ferrymen and the milestone keepers and the postmasters in their small offices, knew each other, depended on each other, and created together something that was more than the sum of its parts. They created a world. A small, unhurried, lantern-lit world. And we are going to spend a little more time in it before we have to leave. Part 9: The Road and the Revolution. There is a night in April of 1775 that almost every American knows, or thinks they know. Paul Revere, on a borrowed horse, riding through the dark. The lanterns in the steeple of the Old North Church. The warning: the regulars are out, carried from house to house through the sleeping countryside northwest of Boston. What is less often remembered, in the romantic retelling, is that Paul Revere was not a post rider. He was a silversmith who served as an express messenger for the revolutionary movement in Boston. But his night ride on April 18, 1775, drew on the same infrastructure that the post roads had spent a century building: the horses, the routes, the local knowledge, the network of trusted contacts who would open a door to a rider in the night and know what his arrival meant. The relationship between the colonial post roads and the American Revolution is profound and complicated, and it begins not on horseback but with ink. The postal system that Benjamin Franklin had spent 20 years building was, as we have seen, a network for the movement of information. By the 1760s and early 1770s, as tensions between the colonies and the British government escalated, that network became an increasingly political instrument. Pamphlets and newspapers traveled the post roads. The political arguments that drove colonial opinion toward revolution, the writings of John Dickinson, James Otis, Thomas Jefferson, Samuel Adams, spread through the colonies via the postal routes. A pamphlet printed in Philadelphia might be read in Boston within a week of its printing, if the post writers were moving it efficiently. A letter from a Boston merchant to a New York correspondent, describing the latest outrage of the customs officials, was read in New York within days and then copied and passed on. This was, in a very real sense, What a revolution looks like from the inside, not dramatic events, but the steady accumulation of shared grievances, spread through a network of communication, producing in communities hundreds of miles apart a gradually converging sense of identity and purpose. The British authorities understood this, at least in part. They knew that the postal system was carrying political material that was uncomfortable for the Crown. After the growing crisis over colonial taxation, royal officials began to monitor postal correspondence more closely, opening letters they suspected of containing seditious material. This surveillance, real or suspected, produced a counter-response from the colonial patriots. Sensitive political correspondence began to travel by private express rather than the official post. A network of what were called committees of correspondence, established in Boston at the instigation of Samuel Adams in 1772, and quickly adopted by other colonies, created an alternative communication system running alongside and partly outside the official postal network. Trusted writers, operating on private account, carried political correspondence that the patriots did not want intercepted. When Benjamin Franklin was dismissed as Deputy Postmaster General in 1774, the break between the colonial postal network and the British Crown became explicit. Franklin returned to America, and within a year, the Continental Congress had established its own postal system, appointing Franklin, now 70 years old and perhaps the most famous person in the colonies, as the first Postmaster General of the United States. This appointment, in July of 1775, was made while the war was already underway. The battles of Lexington and Concord had been fought in April. The Battle of Bunker Hill had been fought in June. The Continental Army was organizing around Boston. And amid all of this, someone had to make sure the mail kept moving. The postal system during the Revolutionary War was a remarkable institution under impossible conditions. Post riders on the main routes were expected to maintain their schedules while British forces controlled some of the roads they traveled, while bridges were destroyed by military operations, while inflation made the payment of wages increasingly complicated, while the military claimed horses and riders for its own purposes. The post roads themselves became military roads. Armies moved along the same routes that post riders and merchants had used for decades. The Continental Army's movements during the war, Washington's retreats across New Jersey, the march to Yorktown, the movements of troops in New England, all followed the road network that the colonial postal system had helped to develop and maintain. Intelligence traveled the roads as well. The spy networks of both sides, the British intelligence network and the American networks that included Abraham Woodhull and the other members of the Culper spy ring, who passed information about British troop movements in New York to Washington's headquarters, used the post roads and private express riders to move their information. A letter carried under a false name, addressed to a tavern keeper in an inland town who would pass it along to the right person, might travel 100 miles in 2 days along a route that had been laid down half a century before. There is a particular story from the Revolutionary period that illustrates the post roads' role in the conflict with unusual clarity. In the winter of 1776 to 1777, following Washington's defeats in New York and his retreat across New Jersey, the American cause was at one of its lowest points. The Continental Army was undersized, underfed, and undersupplied. Morale was poor. The enlistment periods of many soldiers were running out, and there was real danger that the army would simply dissolve. Thomas Paine, who was present with the army during this difficult period, wrote The American Crisis, the pamphlet that begins with the famous line, "These are the times that try men's souls," and had it printed and distributed as quickly as possible. The pamphlet was read to Washington's troops before the Battle of Trenton. And it spread through the colonies via the same postal routes and printing networks that had carried political pamphlets for the previous decade. A writer carrying copies of Paine's pamphlet south from Philadelphia, or north from Philadelphia toward New England, was traveling the same road that Madam Knight had ridden 70 years before. The same milestones marked the same distances. The same inns offered rest and food and the company of other travelers. The same rivers required the same negotiations with the same ferryman's descendants. The road was the same. But what it was carrying had changed the world. After the Revolution, the postal system and its roads were among the first concerns of the new federal government. The Constitution specifically granted Congress the power to establish post offices and post roads, a provision that speaks to how clearly the founders understood that communication infrastructure was fundamental to national life. The Post Office Act of 1792, signed by George Washington, established the framework of the American postal system for decades to come. It set postal rates. It required that newspapers be carried at subsidized rates, understanding, as Franklin had understood, that the circulation of public information was a public good. It established the routes of the official post roads, many of which followed the colonial routes that had been in use for a century. The writers who carried the mail in the early years of the Republic were writing roads that their grandfathers had ridden, and their great-grandfathers before that. The lanterns were the same. The leather satchels were the same. The inns, some of them, were the same buildings, under the same families, serving the same roads. And yet everything had changed. Part 10, The Stagecoach Era, Speed and Community on the Colonial Road. Throughout most of the colonial period, the most common modes of travel along the post roads were the simplest ones, walking and riding on horseback. Walking was for those who could not afford a horse. This included a substantial portion of the population. A laborer walking from Boston to Providence, carrying his tools and his few possessions, covered perhaps 15 or 20 miles a day if the roads were good and he was in reasonable health. He slept where he could, in barns, in the open, occasionally at an inn if he had the money. He arrived dirty and tired, days or weeks after his departure. Horseback riding was faster and available to those who owned a. Part 10, continued the stagecoach era, speed and community on the colonial road. Horseback riding was faster and available to those who owned a horse or could hire one. A rider on a good horse could cover 40 or 50 miles in a day on reasonable roads, which made the journey between New York and Boston a matter of 5 or 6 days rather than 2 or 3 weeks on foot. For merchants and officials and anyone with business to conduct at a distance, the horse was the essential vehicle of colonial life. But there was a third option that became increasingly important as the 18th century progressed: the wheeled vehicle. Wagons for freight. Chaises and chairs, two-wheeled vehicles pulled by a single horse, for private travel. And, eventually, the stagecoach. The stagecoach arrived in the American colonies later than you might expect, given how established it already was in England by the mid-17th century. In England, regular stage services between London and the major provincial cities had been running since the 1640s, and by 1700 they were well organized, relatively fast, and widely used. In the colonies, the roads were for a long time simply too poor to support regular wheeled coach services. A vehicle that could maintain a schedule on the well-maintained turnpikes of England would be destroyed by the mud and ruts of the colonial road within a season. The first regular stagecoach service in colonial America began in New Jersey in 1732, running between Burlington and Amboy, a relatively short route across the flat terrain of central New Jersey that connected the Delaware River to the Raritan River and thereby linked Philadelphia to New York by a combination of road and water. This was a practical route rather than a scenic one, and the stage that ran it was a plain, heavy vehicle designed for durability rather than comfort. By the 1750s, stage services had extended to connect the major cities of the northern colonies, New York and Philadelphia, New York and Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. These were not quick journeys. The stagecoach between New York and Philadelphia in the 1750s took 2 days in good summer conditions, a schedule that would have struck English travelers, accustomed to the faster services of the London to Bristol road, as extremely slow. But it was faster and more comfortable than riding horseback for 2 days, and for those who could afford the fare, it was a genuine improvement. The stagecoaches of the mid-18th century were heavy, four-wheeled vehicles with room for 4 to 6 passengers inside and sometimes additional passengers on the roof, which was considered the cheaper and considerably less comfortable option. The body of the coach hung on leather thoroughbraces, thick straps of leather that absorbed some of the road's impact and allowed the body to sway as the coach moved rather than the steel springs that would come later. This gave the ride a characteristic rocking motion that some passengers found soothing and others found profoundly nauseating, particularly on rough sections of road. The inside of a Colonial stagecoach was close quarters. For passengers on 2 facing benches, their knees almost touching, their baggage stacked above them or wedged beneath the seats or strapped to the exterior of the coach. The windows were covered with leather curtains, there was no glass, which could be lowered in good weather to admit air and light, or raised against rain and cold, in which case the interior became dark and stuffy. In winter, passengers kept warm through a combination of heavy clothing, shared body heat, and the occasional brazier of charcoal placed on the floor, which created its own hazard. The driver, called a coachman, or in American usage increasingly just the driver, sat on a box at the front of the coach, exposed to weather and in full command of the team. Good coach drivers were skilled professionals, capable of handling 4 or 6 horses on narrow roads, through difficult river crossings, and in all weather conditions. They were paid accordingly, and they knew their worth. They were among the more glamorous figures of the colonial road world, admired for their skill, known by name along their routes, treated with a degree of deference at the inns where they stopped. The stagecoach stops were important social events, particularly in the smaller towns along the route. When the stage arrived, announced by the driver's horn, blown a quarter mile out from the inn to give the staff time to prepare, it brought not just passengers but news. People gathered to see who was arriving, to ask the driver what he had seen on the road, to collect any mail or packages that might have come on the coach. The arrival of the stage was, in many small communities, the social high point of the day. The inn stops were scheduled, the stagecoach lines published timetables showing where the stage would stop for meals and for changes of horses, and the inns along established stage routes organized their entire operations around those schedules. A meal stop typically lasted 30 to 45 minutes, just long enough for the passengers to eat quickly, attend to personal necessities, and reboard the coach while the driver oversaw the change to fresh horses. It was hurried and not entirely comfortable, but it was also a chance to stretch, to move, to breathe fresh air, to exchange a few words with other passengers outside the close confines of the coach. Passengers on long stagecoach journeys sometimes formed temporary but surprisingly intense bonds. Shared hardship, a particularly rough section of road, a breakdown, a difficult river crossing, a night stop at a poor inn had a way of breaking down the social formalities that would ordinarily govern interactions between strangers of different social ranks. A merchant and a minister and a young apprentice and a woman traveling to visit her sister, thrown together for 2 days in a rocking leather-curtained box, sometimes emerged from the experience as something close to friends. The conversation in a colonial stagecoach, when the road was smooth enough to allow it without too much bouncing, covered everything. Politics was common, particularly in the years leading up to the Revolution. Religion was common. Colonial America was a deeply religious society, and questions of faith and morality were as natural a topic as the weather. Commerce was constant, the price of goods, the state of the markets, the reliability of this or that business partner. Personal history was exchanged. Advice was freely given and sometimes received. The stagecoach was, in this sense, a remarkable democratic institution. It mixed people of different social backgrounds in a way that the private coach, available only to the wealthy, did not. A wealthy merchant might choose to travel in his own carriage, with his own horses and his own servants, and avoid the company of strangers entirely. But those who traveled by stage were thrown together without much regard for rank, and the shared experience of the road had a genuinely leveling effect. By the time of the American Revolution, the stagecoach had become a familiar part of the landscape of the main colonial roads. By the 1780s and 1790s, as the new republic consolidated and the roads were gradually improved, stage services became faster and more frequent. The journey between New York and Boston, which had taken a week by horseback in the 1720s, could be made in 3 days by stage by the 1790s. The journey between New York and Philadelphia, which had taken 2 days in 1750, could be done in 1 long day by the turn of the century. These improvements came partly from better vehicles and better horses, and partly from the gradual improvement of the roads themselves. Turnpikes, privately built and maintained roads that charged tolls for their use, began to appear in the 1790s and would spread dramatically in the first 2 decades of the 19th century. The turnpikes introduced the concept of a genuinely engineered road surface, gravel or broken stone laid over a graded bed, with drainage ditches on either side to carry away water. On a well-built turnpike, a stage could maintain a speed of 6 or 7 miles per hour, not fast by any modern standard, but significantly faster than anything the old dirt post roads could offer. The old colonial post roads were not immediately superseded. They were improved. The turnpike builders often followed the same routes that the colonial roads had established, the same ridgelines, the same river crossings, the same village-to-village connections. What changed was the surface under the wheels, and through that change, the experience of travel itself was transformed. But the transformation was not yet complete in the colonial period. For most of the 18th century, the road was still what it had always been, a narrow, unpaved track through a landscape of forests and farms, lit at night by moon and stars and the occasional lantern, traveled by riders and coaches and walking men and women who made of the journey what they could. And it is worth remembering, as we move toward the end of this particular story, that the people who traveled that road were not thinking of themselves as historical figures. They were simply going somewhere. They were cold, or they were comfortable. They were hungry, or they had just eaten. They were worried about arriving on time, or they were content to let the journey take as long as it took. They were telling stories to their fellow passengers, or they were sitting in private silence watching the forest move past the window. They were alive on the road in the most ordinary and human way. And that, perhaps, is what we should carry with us from this part of the story. Part 11, Messages in the Dark, What the Mail Carried. The leather satchel of a colonial post rider, if we could open it and read what was inside, would tell us more about the inner life of colonial America than almost any official document. Letters were not yet the casual communication they would become with literacy and cheap postage in a later century. In the colonial period, writing a letter was an event. Paper was not cheap. Ink required preparation. The ability to write well was not universal, though literacy rates in New England were considerably higher than in most of the world at that time. And the cost of sending a letter, those 9 pence or 18 pence that Franklin's regulated rates required, was significant enough that people thought carefully before they wrote. What this means is that the letters that did travel the post road were, in most cases, letters that mattered. They were not casual notes or quick updates. They were considered documents, written with care, carrying information, or feeling that the writer deemed important enough to spend money on. Commercial correspondence was the most common content of the colonial mail. Merchants wrote to their suppliers and their customers, their agents and their creditors. A Philadelphia merchant might write to a London house requesting a shipment of cloth, to a Boston correspondent inquiring about the price of molasses, to a New York agent authorizing the sale of a consignment of furs. The mail was, in this sense, the infrastructure of commerce. Without reliable postal service, the web of trade and credit that connected the colonies to each other and to the wider Atlantic world would have frayed and broken. But the mail also carried something more intimate. Family correspondence, the letters between parents and children, between siblings separated by the distances that colonial life imposed, between husbands and wives when one was traveling on business, traveled the same leather satchels as the commercial documents. These letters, when they survive in archives, are among the most moving documents of the colonial period. A mother in Boston writing to a son who had gone to sea, not knowing whether her letter would reach him or whether he was still alive to receive it. A young woman in New Haven writing to her betrothed in Philadelphia, describing the preparations for their wedding, the small details of daily life, the changes in her family since he last visited. A father writing to a daughter who had married and moved to a distant colony, asking after her children, sending news of home, closing with a formal expression of affection that barely conceals something much warmer beneath it. The colonial letter had a particular physical quality that is worth imagining. Paper was expensive enough that writers used every inch of it. Letters were often written in a close hand across the full surface of a sheet, and then the paper was turned 90 degrees and written across again, a practice called crosswriting, to double the amount of text on a single sheet and thereby reduce the cost of postage. Reading a cross-written letter required patience and a good eye, but the recipients were used to it. The letter was then folded, there were no envelopes, into a compact packet. The writer dripped sealing wax on the flap and pressed their seal into it, a signet ring, or simply a thumbprint, or a small device purchased for the purpose. The address was written on the outside, the name of the recipient, the town, and sometimes a more specific direction that would help the postmaster know where to deliver it or who to ask for it. Sometimes the address included routing instructions, to be left at the post office in New Haven until called for, or to be forwarded by the first post to Hartford. This folded, sealed, addressed packet then entered the postal system. It was handed to a postmaster, logged in his record book, placed in the outgoing mail bundle. A writer collected it along with all the other letters for that day's departure and placed it in the portmanteau, the sealed leather satchel. And then it began its journey. The journey of a letter was not always direct. A letter from a small town in Connecticut to a correspondent in Virginia might travel first to the nearest post office on the main route, then to New York, then south to Philadelphia, then to Annapolis or Williamsburg, changing hands multiple times before reaching its destination. At each transfer, there was the possibility of delay, of misfiling, of the letter being placed in the wrong bundle. Letters were lost in transit, sometimes found months later in the back of a post office drawer, sometimes never found at all. The emotional experience of the colonial mail was therefore one of uncertainty as much as anticipation. You sent a letter not knowing whether it would arrive. You waited for a reply not knowing whether your letter had been received, and therefore not knowing whether the silence meant that your correspondent had nothing to say or that your letter had been lost. This uncertainty was a genuine psychological burden for people who were waiting for important news about a sick relative, about a business matter, about a political crisis. Franklin understood this, and one of his most important innovations was to require that post writers provide receipts for letters they carried, and that the arrival of mail at each post office be logged. This created, for the first time, a paper trail that allowed senders and recipients to track, at least in theory, where their letters had gone and whether they had arrived. It did not eliminate uncertainty, but it reduced it, and it made the postal service more accountable. There is something else in those leather satchels that deserves attention: newspapers. The Colonial newspaper was a remarkable institution. By the middle of the 18th century, nearly every major colonial city had at least one newspaper, and the larger cities had several. These papers, printed on a single large sheet folded into 4 pages, containing news from London, from other colonies, from the local community, and a considerable quantity of commercial advertising, were the primary medium through which colonial Americans understood the wider world. And they traveled the post roads. The Postal Act of 1792 that formalized the new republic's postal system specifically provided for the subsidized carriage of newspapers, but the practice had been established long before that, partly at Franklin's instigation. A printer who was also a postmaster, as Franklin was, and as many colonial printers were, had an obvious interest in ensuring that his papers traveled efficiently along the postal routes to paying subscribers. A newspaper arriving in a small Connecticut town from Boston or New York was passed from hand to hand, read aloud in the tavern, discussed and argued over, and finally worn to fragments. Subscription to a newspaper was not uncommon even among people of modest means, if they lived on a post road that made delivery possible. For those who could not afford a subscription, the copy at the tavern served the same purpose. The news in a colonial newspaper might be weeks or months old by the time it was printed. The packet from London took 6 to 8 weeks in good conditions, and the newspaper could only publish what it had received. But even old news was valuable in a world where information moved slowly, and the alternative to old news was no news at all. Buried in those newspapers, alongside shipping news and commodity prices and local court proceedings, were the letters and essays and arguments that shaped colonial political thought. The newspapers were not merely reporters of events, they were forums for debate, arenas of public argument, vehicles for the gradual articulation of what it meant to be an American. All of this, the commercial letters, the family correspondence, the political pamphlets, the newspapers, traveled the same road, in the same leather satchel, on the back of the same horse. The post road was not just a road for things and people. It was a road for ideas. And ideas, as the 18th century would demonstrate with some force, can change the world. There is one more category of mail that traveled the colonial post road and that deserves a moment's attention, because it speaks to the human dimensions of this story in a particular way. Among the letters carried by colonial post writers were many that were never claimed at the post office. Letters addressed to people who had died before the letter arrived, or who had moved without leaving a forwarding address, or who could not afford the postage due on arrival. The recipient, in the colonial postal system, paid the postage rather than the sender, which meant that a letter could be refused if the cost was prohibitive. These unclaimed letters accumulated in post offices, sometimes for years, before eventually being auctioned off or destroyed. They were, in a sense, the most poignant category of colonial correspondence, messages sent but never received, words written for someone who never read them. In the larger post offices, the postmasters were required by regulation to post lists of unclaimed letters in a public place, so that people who were expecting mail could check whether it was waiting for them. These lists survive in some archives, and they are a strange and affecting record, columns of names, ordinary people's names, waiting for the reader who never came. John Williams, of Wethersfield. Mary Thompson, to be called for. Samuel Hale and Company. Elizabeth Carter. Names without stories. Words without readers. Letters that rode all that way, through the dark and the mud and the river crossings, and arrived to silence. Part 12, The Last Lanterns, the End of the Colonial Road. Every world ends, and is replaced by another world. The ending is rarely dramatic. It is usually a slow dissolving, a gradual replacement of one thing by another, so gradual that no one moment can be called the last. The colonial post road did not end on a specific date. It transformed. It became something else, something faster and harder and less intimate, while still following many of the same paths through the same landscape. The transformation began, as we have noted, with the turnpikes. The first great turnpike era in America ran from roughly 1790 to 1830, and during those 4 decades the main road network of the eastern United States was substantially rebuilt on engineered surfaces that could carry heavier loads at higher speeds than the old dirt roads had allowed. The Lancaster Turnpike, opened in 1795, ran from Philadelphia 62 miles west to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and was the first long-distance macadamized road in the United States. It was surfaced with broken stone packed to a depth of several inches over a carefully graded bed, with proper drainage ditches on either side. A coach on the Lancaster Turnpike could maintain speeds that would have seemed almost alarming on the old colonial roads. The turnpikes spread. In New England, the old Boston Post Road was gradually improved section by section, with turnpike companies taking over the maintenance of specific stretches in exchange for the right to charge tolls. The milestones that Franklin's administration had installed still stood, but they were now surrounded by a better road than they had originally marked. Travel became faster. Stagecoach lines became more frequent and more competitive. By the 1820s, the journey between New York and Boston that had taken Madam Knight 2 weeks in 1704 could be accomplished in about 36 hours by the fastest express stages, which traveled day and night with frequent changes of horses. This was still a substantial journey, but it was a different order of experience than the muddy, lantern-lit traverse of a century before. The post riders were not immediately replaced. Even as stagecoach services improved and expanded, the post riders continued on the routes that were too light in traffic, too remote, or too poorly rowed for stage services. In rural areas, and on the frontier, riders carrying the mail in a leather satchel on horseback remained the primary form of postal service well into the 19th century. The image of the lone rider on a country road with the mail would persist, transformed but recognizable, all the way to the Pony Express of 1860, itself a response to a specific communication crisis at the edge of the settled world, a technological throwback to the oldest form of the postal service in the moment before the telegraph made it obsolete. But the world of the colonial post road, the particular quality of life that it represented and sustained, was already fading by the 1820s and 1830s. The canal era added another dimension to the transportation network. The railroad, arriving in the 1830s and spreading with astonishing speed through the 1840s and 1850s, accomplished the final transformation. Suddenly the mail could travel not at the speed of a horse but at the speed of a steam engine, 20, 30, 40 miles per hour on the main lines. The journey that had taken days was now a matter of hours. The inns along the old post roads did not all survive this transition. Some adapted, becoming destinations in their own right rather than way stations, or transforming into general stores and meeting halls. Others were simply abandoned as the flow of travel moved to the railroad lines and the towns and inns that had grown up around them. You can find, along the old post road routes, the remains of inns that flourished in the 18th century, buildings that stand empty, or that have been converted to other uses, their original purpose visible only in the width of the chimney and the layout of the rooms. The route itself survives, in a form. The modern U.S. Route 1 follows, for much of its length, the path of the old Boston Post Road. It passes through the same Connecticut and Rhode Island towns that Madam Knight passed through on her journey in 1704: Milford, Bridgeport, Fairfield, Westport, Greenwich, and onward into New York. The road is wider now, paved, lined with gas stations and strip malls and suburban developments that would be entirely alien to any colonial traveler. But the underlying route, the specific path from town to town, the particular way the road bends around a hill or crosses a river, often reflects the original alignment, which reflects the indigenous trail that preceded it, which reflects the movement of animals through the landscape thousands of years before that. The road remembers. Even when everything built along it has changed. There is a moment that several historians of colonial America have noted, and that seems worth marking here as a kind of conclusion to this particular story. In 1790, in the first full year of the new American Republic, the federal government conducted a count of all the post offices in the United States and the routes that served them. The total was 75 post offices, served by just under 2,000 miles of post roads. A small system by any standard, serving a country of nearly 4 million people spread across an enormous territory. By 1800, there were 900 post offices and 20,000 miles of post roads. By 1820, there were 4,000 post offices. By 1840, when the railroad was just beginning to transform the system, there were more than 13,000 post offices serving a country that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River and beyond. This growth, from 75 post offices to 13,000 in 50 years, is one of the most striking examples of infrastructure expansion in American history. It represents the relentless extension of the colonial postal tradition across an ever wider territory, the carrying of that thread of connection, that leather satchel full of other people's words, further and further into a continent that was still, in so many places, being known for the first time by the settlers who were arriving in it. The post riders who carried the mail into Kentucky in the 1780s, into Ohio in the 1790s, into Indiana and Illinois in the first decades of the new century, were doing what the writers of the Boston Post Road had done a century before, extending the nervous system of a society into new territory, making connection possible where there had been only distance and silence. They did it in the same way, on horseback, along routes that often followed indigenous paths, carrying a leather bag full of letters from people who were trying to stay in touch with the world they had left and the people they had left in it. The method was as old as the idea of sending a message. The need it answered was as old as separation. And the road, that narrow, muddy, lantern-lit road running through the forest and the farmland and the river valleys of a continent learning its own shape, that road was the answer the land itself had been waiting to offer. There is one more thing worth saying before we leave this world. The Colonial Post Road was, in the end, a human achievement. Not a grand or glamorous one. Not the kind of achievement that gets monuments built to it or names inscribed in the history books in large letters. but a human achievement in the deepest sense, people solving a real problem, through practical intelligence and steady effort over long time, in a way that made life better for other people. The postmaster who kept careful records. The writer who crossed the river in February when the ice was questionable and the mail needed to get through. The innkeeper who kept a clean room and good food on the road. The woman with the lantern hanging from her saddle, alone in the winter forest, carrying words from someone to someone else across the dark and the cold. These people made a world. It was a small world, lantern-lit and unhurried. But it was real, and it was connected, and within it people knew themselves to be part of something larger than their own particular village or farm or household. That knowledge, the knowledge of connection, of belonging to a wider community, was what the post road carried most fundamentally. More important than the commercial letters, more important than the political pamphlets, more important than the newspapers. The knowledge that someone, somewhere, had thought of you. Had taken a sheet of paper and sat down by candlelight and put words on it and folded it and sealed it and paid the postage and placed it in the hands of a writer who would carry it through the dark to wherever you were. That someone had sent it. And that the road would bring it to you. Eventually. Closing meditation. The road is quiet now. It has been quiet for a long time. The post riders are gone. The colonial inns have changed their faces or vanished entirely into the landscape. The leather satchels have become digital signals, invisible and instantaneous, carrying nothing that can be touched or smelled or held up to the candlelight. But somewhere under the modern road, the old road is still there. The packed earth. The milestones. The places where generations of horses put their feet down in the same spots, wearing a path into the world. And somewhere in that old road, if you are very still and very quiet, you can almost hear it. The slow rhythm of hooves on cold ground. The creak of leather. The sound of a rider moving through a dark forest before dawn, carrying words from one world to another. Let that sound settle into you now. Let your body grow heavy, the way the colonial traveler's body grew heavy at the end of the day's ride, grateful for the stillness and the warmth and the firelight. Your hands can rest. Your shoulders can release. The weight of the day can be set down, like a leather satchel at the end of the road. You have traveled far enough. There is no more distance to cover tonight. No more river crossings, no more dark stretches through the forest, no more uncertainty about what lies around the next bend. The inn is warm. The fire is settled to quiet coals. The candles have burned low. Outside, the forest is still, and the road is empty, and the moon is moving slowly across the sky above the bare winter trees. You are here. You are safe. You are warm. The old world has grown quiet around you. The lanterns are going out, one by one, along the road. Let your breathing slow now. Let each breath out be a little longer than the breath in. Let the darkness behind your eyes be the comfortable darkness of a well-built room, warm and still. Somewhere, a post rider is still out there on the road. Moving through the cold and the dark, carrying his bag of words. He knows the way. He always knows the way. You do not need to know it tonight. Tonight you can simply rest. In the warm room. By the quiet fire. At the end of a long day's ride through the lantern-lit world. The road goes on. But not tonight. Not tonight. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.